Hello and welcome to California Connections. I'm Kevin Yamamura, political reporter for the Sacramento Bee who covers the state budget. For the last several years, January has been fraught with budget misery as Governors Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jerry Brown announced deficits as large as $42 billion. Today that chapter may be closed, at least if you believe Governor Brown's newest declaration that California no longer faces a deficit. After years of spending cuts and an infusion of voter-approved taxes, the state appears to be closer to budget balance than at any time since before the recession. Governor Brown presented a $97 billion budget on Thursday, January 10th. Brown proposed increasing spending for education, but holding the line for most other programs. His austerity message won support from both Republicans and Democrats, but some Democratic allies criticized the governor for giving nothing more to safety net programs, an issue we expect to be debated in the months ahead. Joining us are H.D. Palmer from the Department of Finance, Senator Mark DeSaulnier, an East Bay Democrat who sits on the Senate's Budget Committee, and Senate Republican leader Bob Huff from Southern California, who previously served as vice chair on the Senate Budget Committee. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you.
HG, what do you think it'll take for us to keep the era of deficits behind us?
Well, I think it's going to take a couple of things. One, some of which is under our control, some of it's not. Governor Brown indicated pretty clearly that 2013 is going to be the year of fiscal discipline. He understands very much how we got to this point, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we made very difficult but necessary decisions over the last 2 years to bring general fund spending down. We can't throw the gear shift in reverse, in his view, and undo or unwind a lot of those reductions if we want to stay on a path towards structural balance. Things we don't control, one could come as early as February. What happens with the federal government, what they do or do not do with the debt ceiling. If they don't take sufficient action and the economy goes into a recession, that could hurt our revenues. All the more reason, in the governor's view, to be very prudent when it comes to a spending plan that he put forward.
Thanks. Senator DeSaulnier, what was your takeaway from the governor's budget yesterday?
I'm very supportive. I think the things that we have done, a lot of people don't think the legislature works together, but the things that we have done, and it's not always been kumbaya moments, there are tough debates about it, but we have implemented most of the governor's cuts from the last 2 years. They were very painful, and I think we should continue to be prudent, as the governor suggested.
Senator Huff, what about your thoughts?
Well, I don't want to be Danny Downer here, but
Why change now?
yeah, why change now? When there's extra resources, or money in this case, certainly the job is easier, and people are kind of singing kumbaya about how great it is. I don't think that we're out of the woods yet. HD talked about some of the problems that still face us out there. We still have a housing recovery, even though it's starting to turn around. We don't know if it has legs on it. There's a lot of other second-tiered home mortgages that are underwater that, you know, if anything happens, these people are out of their homes. There's a lot of mitigating factors, and so the fact that it has a built-in billion-dollar reserve, if that's a real figure and not just something as a placeholder for more government growth, that's a good thing. The fact that it puts $2.7 billion in the new funding for schooling is good, although the governor promised that, you know, all the money from the taxes was going to go there. You know, there's a lot of things to like about it, but there's still a cautionary note.
Is there anything you would do differently at this stage, knowing what we know about these projections and what the economy is doing right now?
Well, even last year before the tax increase, if education is your highest priority, you do that. I don't think I would have given I don't think I would have let the previous cuts from IHSS expire. I don't think I would have automatically done away with the furlough program that was cut, or to put in an increase in pay just yet. Let's get out of this debt that we have sooner rather than later. We know that the voters are looking at the state now to see if we can act responsibly with the money. We got partway there yesterday. We have a long way to go, and this is just January. We have a full appetite for new spending that'll be unfolding as bills are introduced and as we get toward the May revision and the final budget.
What about you, Senator DeSaulnier? Anything you would do differently than what the governor proposed yesterday?
Well, I think we have to have a discussion, as Bob has suggested, in the next few months as the budget subcommittee start to meet. The last 2 years, I was chair of this budget sub 3, Health and Human Services. We made really difficult cuts. IHSS was not something that I agreed to, so I differ with Bob. I think as we have to be sensitive about the economic recovery, I agree with Bob in that way, but the safety net, we know that people who are below the poverty rate in California has grown. So we don't want that to get worse, because that won't help the recovery either.
Great. HD, the governor had a plan for higher education where he increases funding, but also asks the systems to impose some new measures, particularly pertaining to caps on the number of courses they take and some other efficiency measures. Can you explain that a little bit more? And do you think UC and CSU have enough money, sufficient resources to avoid tuition hikes?
Well, we certainly hope so. The governor, following through on what he said last year, is in his budget renewing an investment in higher education. But it's not just a question of the dollars. One of the things that has allowed UC to grow in recent years is because of the fact that they've had significant tuition increases, as well as CSU. And one of the things that is causing a lot of debt for students and their parents is time to graduation, because most of the students at UC and CSU can't get a degree and get out in 4 years. And the less courses that are available for them to be able to get those degrees, the longer they're in, the more the costs are going to be, the longer the debt is. So the governor wants both UC and CSU systems to implement reforms to improve times to completion as part of his overall plan for higher education. He's going to be taking that message directly to the Board of Regents and to the Board of Trustees in the coming weeks because he believes that we need to renew that investment in higher education, but it's got to be affordable and it's got to be predictable, both for the students and their parents.
Senator Huff, what do you think? Do they have enough money to hold the line on tuition? We've seen these increases since the recession. What do you think?
I think there's enough money in there. There's a lot of pressure. We have a world-class university system. We certainly don't want to compromise on that. And yet we have some very generous pensions and other things over there. I mean, there's always room to improve. And as HD talked about, even efficiency within the system, so people have a clear path of how they get to where they want to go with a degree. I mean, I often tell people I went to 3 colleges and graduated in 4 years. You can't even do that in 1 college anymore because the system's so convoluted. They don't offer the right classes at the right time. We have some classes that are perhaps not even necessary to help somebody be a intelligent, functioning adult. But clearly, if we can make that pathway shorter, if we can get articulation between the different educational systems, we can help keep the cost down.
How about you, Senator?
Well, all the economists have told us the 2 things we could do to help the economy in California is take care of our own fiscal house, which I believe we're doing and the governor's doing, and the other thing is invest in education. We're told that we're moving to a knowledge-based economy, that the jobs of the future require a knowledgeable workforce. You've got the best education system historically in the world, public education system, so we have to reinvest in that if we're going to stay competitive globally.
Thanks. And you've examined the Senator DeSaulnier, you've examined the Health and Human Services budget. The governor on Thursday committed to expanding Medi-Cal to low-income adults who currently do not qualify, this so-called optional expansion. What do you think of that commitment, and what do you think about his concern about cost increases in that area?
There are huge concerns. When we went through that, when we went through the healthy family debate, that I supported the governor, but I had some real concerns about it, as Senator Huff knows. We're looking at a real challenge this year. We go into the special session on health care reform. The governor, and I agree with him, that we want to be right at the forefront in enacting the ACA, the American Affordable Care Act. So we have real challenges in California. We have a very diverse client base, and it's going to be tough to serve them and bring their health care services up while we control the cost.
Senator Huff, is that a good direction to go toward to commit ourselves to expanding Medi-Cal to the new population?
I don't think we have to be at the head of the curve, which I believe this puts us. As I understand it, it's one of the first steps of implementing Obamacare, and yet we don't know what Congress is going to be doing with that yet. So my preference would be wait until it's fully implemented and funded at the federal level before we start making those steps here. We already have such huge costs in all the social services, and we tend to be a little more generous in California. We want to provide a safety net. We want to help people that are down and out, but at the end of the day, health services are some of the most rapidly growing expenses. And even though we've just raised the taxes, we're on a pathway to our own fiscal cliff that'll be unsupportable because we're growing our own budget $6 billion a year. Well, that's the amount the taxes coming in. So what do you do after 7 years and this expires?
HD, the governor laid out a path in which the state would either take responsibility for that new population or possibly counties. Can you just explain that a little bit more?
Sure. The governor wants to enter into a dialogue this year on what is the best way to implement this going forward. The good news is that relative to other states, we're ahead of the curve. We're one of the first states to implement an exchange called Covered California. That's well underway. But the governor wants to have a discussion about which is the best way to go to have an affordable and sustainable expansion of the healthcare system, which is why he put out two options. One would be a state-run Medicaid program, or one would be one that's run by the counties, because whatever we do in this, there's going to be an inextricable relationship between the state and the counties. And so the governor wants to engage on that with all the stakeholders early as possible.
Great. The governor did increase funding not only for the universities but also K-12 schools, and with that he proposed a new local control funding formula. I'm curious, he used the word controversial yesterday. He said that there could be some areas, poverty, high poverty or English learner districts that receive more of the growth than some of the suburban areas. He even said, there are differences between places growing up in Richmond and Beverly Hills. I'm curious, Senator DeSaulnier, what do you think of this new formula and the way it distributes money and the way it gives local officials control?
Well, I think it's generally good, but it's going to be complicated and it is going to be controversial. I have represented a district that has very large pockets of poverty. You reference Richmond, and I also have areas that are amongst the wealthiest in the state. Some of those school districts have historically been low return source, so that's part of the discussion as well. But I do agree with him, not to quote Aristotle, is we know in the East Bay, in the Bay Area, the test scores track the poverty rate. The high-income neighborhoods, the test scores are really good. The kids go on to find four-year schools generally. The poor neighborhoods, they're in poverty. They end up being institutionalized often for the rest of their lives. So I think the direction is right, but we're going to have a real robust discussion about it.
And just on that point, I mean, do you think that more finances, as the governor proposed, would bring those test scores up? Would bring those performances up?
Clearly they would. The research that Stanford did when Arnold Schwarzenegger was president, whoops, that was a Freudian slip. I wouldn't have voted for that, by the way. Apparently. When he was governor, it indicated you've got to spend more money. Personally, I think it should be targeted with some of the realignment things we've done. In the East Bay, we know where the targeted families are, and it's not just when they're in the classroom, it's when they go home as well that we have to support them.
Senator Huff, what are your thoughts on this local control funding formula?
I like local control. I have some concerns about the weighted formula. As Senator DeSaulnier talked about, I represent both extremes as well. And some of the lowest funded schools I have are some of the highest performing, and yet they're on the verge of bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. So how does this new formula affect them? Looking at that Stanford study that Senator DeSaulnier talked about, they also said to put more money into education without changing the outcomes would be a waste of money. We have spent, if you adjust for inflation, over the last 20 years, we're spending, well, at least for the latest data we have, which is obviously not the last couple of years, but 170% of what we were after inflation 20 years ago, and our performance has flatlined, if not dropped down a little bit. So it's not just money, although money certainly helps, just like it helps the state budget. So we have to put upon the educational community some deliverables, much like private business does. They don't just go to the board and say, we need more money. They say, okay, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to, and then they assess to see if we get there. That's something government does not do. We do not go after performance. We just assume money will solve the problem, and that would be a mistake if we do that with education.
Kevin, I think it's really important. In the 60s, I believe, Congress did something called the Jenkins Report that said that 60% of the outcomes for students were because of socioeconomic impacts. So we have to look at the child their whole lifetime when they're at home. The social model's changed, and I think that kind of investment, I hope, is where the governor's going.
Sorry,
I
go ahead,
just
Senator.
have one last thing here. My first year in the Assembly, I've always been on the Education
Watch out,
Committee.
you've lost control.
Yeah, I know. Well, he's sort of happy about that. My first year in the Assembly, we were looking at an educational hearing regarding high poverty, low performance, and it's almost a one-to-one correlation. Mm-hmm. And yet, so the conclusion we were supposed to be coming to is we need more money. There was one pixel that stood out. It was high poverty, high performance, and I said, this is very informative. I'd like to know more about that pixel. How did they defy the odds? And I got a call the next day from one of these guys that actually pays attention to what's going on in the legislature, and he's in one of these think tanks. He says, you want to know about that pixel? And so he sent me some data that showed that you had leadership, a principal that said, you know what, we will not take failure. And she was allowed to build a team that shared her vision, and she was able to turn it around. So it didn't take more money, it took vision. And the real question is, how do you replicate that kind of performance, that kind of passion, that kind of results, and put it in the whole system? Well, you can't, but you can certainly do more of that. Even if we made it easier to get rid of poor performing teachers, we would raise scores dramatically if we just took care of the lowest 10% of non-performing teachers. Most of them are doing a great job. Some of them are not. It drags down the whole system.
Okay. HD, do you want to add anything on this formula that the governor's come out with?
Yeah, I would. There are about 6.2 million students in the K through 12 system today. 3.3 million of them, more than half, are either English language learners or coming from a low economic background, as defined as being eligible for a free or reduced price meal at school. And as we've said here at this table, the research has indicated that these are the students who have the greatest challenges coming in to learn. And so what the governor is proposing with this formula is that as all of the school districts grow in funding over the years, we target a portion of that growth for these students because we want to give them the greatest opportunities to succeed. And so we're going to enter into a good discussion on this year. We're going to have the language out. We will show our projections on what the districts are going to look like under this formula. And it's important to note this isn't going to be something that we're going to do in a year. We're talking about implementing this over a 7-year period. So it's not going to be immediate. It's not going to be disruptive. We want to get all of the input from members of the legislature and the education community, educators, to help us flesh this out, because the governor believes that this is the right way to go. And for those areas that have not been served, for these kinds of students, we believe this gives them a much greater opportunity to find success in K through 12 schools and go on to have a productive life.
Just on his proposal in education, particularly K-12, he has said or proposed that there would be more money for K-3 and hopefully, I guess he says, for class size reduction. Do you think that families watching this, they'll see in their schools that the class sizes will actually shrink as a result of this additional money coming into the budget?
That school districts may opt to do that. One of the things that the governor has talked about in terms of the accountability is to give local school officials greater authority over setting their budgets. The terminology that's used here is so-called categorical programs, where Sacramento tells school districts, you can have this pot of money, but you can only spend it for this particular program or this particular aspect of education. And over the years, that's kind of built up, and where you've got dozens and dozens and dozens of these Sacramento-driven formulas. So what the governor has done is to say, let's break down the silos, let's break down these walls, let this money be prioritized by local school districts about what the greatest needs are for their students, because it's going to vary from a rural district to an urban district, and they should have the greater authority and accountability to be able to set those priorities at the local level.
Senator Huff, what kinds of, as we see more money being devoted to education as projected by the governor, I mean, what kinds of ways would you like to see that money spent at the schools?
I would like to see us reward high-performing teachers with more compensation. It's difficult to attract great teachers. It's, they're not going to retire poor, but there's a lot of competition for good teachers. I'd like to see an investment in technology and that we stay up. Technology is very expensive to keep up on, but that's the world these guys live in at home, the ones that can afford it. And I think that helps build that gap between the poorer areas and the more affluent. I've been in charter schools where they'll get nonprofits to donate technology. That's one way they overcome, not having the funding necessary to do it. But certainly it's a technology world that they will work in someday, and we need to do a better job of equipping them at the schools.
And how about Senator DeSaulnier? What would you like to see?
First on the categoricals, we know from the experience in New York State that both politically and the results, they had to do this, I think, about 5 years ago, where they cut something like 25–30% of it. But each one of those groups have their own constituencies that we're going to hear from, and that'll be the tough political process. For me, I think I would agree with Bob. I think accountability, helping all of the teachers, and I agree with Bob in the sense when you get a bad teacher, there's nothing worse. That's a calling, that's a responsibility. But I also think on early development, you mentioned K through 3. I mean, everything we know from the research and everything we know because the social model has changed, as I often mention, with two-income families, young kids need to have a lot of support as they get developed, and we know the rest of the industrial world is doing that. They're investing in early child development.
Let's switch gears to another announcement the governor made in the same week as he released his budget, which is on prisons. He asked federal judges to lift the cap on the state's prison population. Senator DeSaulnier, do you think that's a good idea, the approach he's taken?
I think it's a responsible approach. I chaired the budget subcommittee the first 2 years I was in the Senate that had corrections in it. We were going through a lot of things at that time. We had 23 lawsuits. I think both this administration in particular is focused on eliminating the litigation. We've done some remarkable things. The governor's done some remarkable things in realignment and changing. We've got a lot of challenges in that field, but in general, we've made some real good steps in the correction systems.
Senator Huff?
I agree with the governor in that. I always thought it was arbitrary what the judges did in the first place. In fact, one of the receivers said when we questioned him how he's going to pay for this grand scheme that he had, he said, well, I'll back my truck up to the Treasury if I have to. And certainly that's how they implemented it. There was no cost. When we were struggling throughout every line item of the budget, and it seemed like prisons were, there was no end in sight, and that definitely has to change. I think that the care that they get, they do have a constitutional level of care, but they're getting Cadillac care that our average citizens don't get.
HD, do you think that our realignment is working as expected? This is a big change that the governor implemented his first year in office. And
we believe so. We think it is important to bring it back to local control because these inmates, once they get out, are going to go back to their city or county of origin, and better for them to be there with not only supervision but with an array of services that we hope is going to keep them from reoffending, whether it's drug and alcohol treatment, whether it's foster care issues that are associated with that. But it has dropped the prison population dramatically. The alternative to agreeing with the court order would have been to let a lot of people out who shouldn't be let out, and the governor didn't think that was a smart thing to do. One of the things that we've had to deal with during this receivership is that the budgetary authority over prison health care doesn't lie with anybody sitting at this table. It doesn't sit with the governor, it doesn't sit with the legislature. It has been given to a receiver who is independently appointed by a court body who has essentially a blank check. We've seen prison health care costs grow by about $1.8 billion since 1998. And the bulk of that is due to the fact that the court cases over which the receiver has authority, they can spend whatever they want. They can set what salaries they want. They can hire as many people as they want. We think that we have demonstrated that we can provide an adequate level of care, and we have reduced population so that it is time to give the authority back to the state because we've demonstrated that we can run these prisons in an effective manner, and we are providing the level of health care that is necessary.
Thanks. Let me ask just about the capital dynamics. We had an election in November that shifted some of the power balance and giving Democrats supermajority control of both houses. Senator Huff, I mean, how does that change your approach to this budget? We've already seen changes subsequent to Prop 25, which allowed Democrats at least to pass the budget plan itself on a majority vote. But what does this latest change do for your party, and how does it change your thinking?
I don't think it changes the budget a whole lot or the budget process. That happened a couple of years ago when the voters gave the legislature majority vote power over the budget. Since that time, you've seen pretty much an end run around Republicans. We have our subcommittee meetings. They dutifully listen to what we have to say, but then they ignore them and do their own thing. And we don't have big 5 meetings anymore. It's a big 3, if that. So, the dynamics won't change a whole lot. Each of us still represents 931,000 people back in our district, and they like us. And there's no monopoly or supermajority of good ideas. So You know, some of our guys put out the idea we ought to freeze tuition while these taxes are in effect, and the governor said he suggested, I think was more the way it was characterized by him, but for 4 years, it's not 7, but you know, those ideas are good ideas, and they're not Democrat or Republican, they're just people that are thinking and trying to represent their people.
Senator DeSaulnier, on your side, do you have a supermajority, which means you could, if you could get all of the votes of your caucus.
Don't be frightened, Bob.
Super minority.
How's that phone booth that you have the caucus meetings at? Oh,
Getting into our Superman
we're
outfits.
friends.
Yes.
We're friends.
How are you going to use that power? I mean, you could pass taxes if you had everybody vote for them in your caucus.
Well, I'm one who believes that good fiscal policy is good social policy. Bob and I probably agree on a lot of things in terms of fiscal policy and efficiency. We're very different on social policy on some key things. But that's part of democracy. I think the voters clearly said that they were happy to have they voted for new revenue. We've been saying all along that we both need to cut. We have a mixture of cuts and revenue. And we've succeeded. Now I think we have to govern responsibly and be consistent with what we asked the voters to do that they gave us.
Do you think that after voters gave you Prop 30 and Prop 39, that is there any room for more taxes, or do you think that now you're not going to pursue any more taxes?
I think we have to look real carefully. I think for the average Californian, their income is still, there's a lot of pressure on them. The wealthy, not so much, and they've grown. But for the average Californian, they're still struggling to pay their mortgage and get their kids to school. So I think we have to be sensitive to that, or I believe that they will turn on us, the voters. I think there's still an opportunity to look at how we deliver services and be more efficient about how we deliver services, which should be a bipartisan effort. If we invest more wisely and we have better outcomes, that's better for everybody, and it's better for California and America.
Are there any particular issues, Senator Huff, that you think Republicans will have, where their votes will be pivotal in helping on the budget? Any areas that you can think of at this time?
Not on the budget per se. I think we can certainly be a sounding board, and we can continue to advocate what we believe is good fiscal policy that probably doesn't have too many voices advocating that in the Capitol. So that can be our role, to provide at least a counterpoint so that we don't all get this groupthink that sometimes happens at the Capitol.
And HD, do you have any thoughts on how the governor will approach the coming spring and the new dynamics in the Capitol?
Well, first of all, blissfully political dynamics are outside of my portfolio, the Department of Finance. That said, I mean, the governor will welcome constructive input and ideas from all members of the legislature, regardless of their political party. As Senator DeSaulnier noted, the people of this state entrusted this governor and this legislature with a lot when they passed Proposition 30, and now the governor believes we have to prove that we're worthy of that trust.
Great. Well, I appreciate your time. Thanks for being here to discuss the budget just after the governor released it. We have not much time left, so I thank the viewers for watching us here today on California Connections, and we'll be looking forward to what happens in the months ahead as the budget goes through the legislative process, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks.
Okay, we're clear, but we're going to reshoot the intro.
Okay.
So nobody move.
All right.
Can I have you stay seated for a second so we can take the intro? We blew it.
You blew it?
Oh, honestly.
Yeah. We
10 demerits. Jeez.
Kevin, how can you work with this?
I don't know.
Kevin, could you just,
Yeah.
we're going on the wide shot, Palmer, Mr. DeSaulnier, and Mr. Huff, around on the wide shot, all right?
So do it all the way through to just
With-
thanks for
how
being
do you
here.
say, with us
Joining us
today,
are-
joining us are, at that point I'm on a wide shot, and you're just going to.
Wait, am I just doing that part?
Yeah,
So
just that part.
just start with joining us.
Yeah,
Okay.
joining us right there, all right. Count from 3.
Do you want me to describe you guys in any different ways?
I could use a few
Handsome.
positive things.
Full hair.
You can say debonair for me, but that would be wrong.
Okay.
We're just staying on camera 3 the whole time, right? Okay. All right, here we go. Oh, hold on. Count up from 5, please. Okay, 5, 4, 3.
Joining us are H.D. Palmer from the Department of Finance, Senator Mark DeSaulnier, an East Bay Democrat who sits on the Senate's Budget Committee, and Senate Republican leader Bob Huff from Southern California, who previously served as Vice Chair on the Senate Budget Committee. Thank you all for being here today.